All right, we're in 1 Peter chapter 2, so go ahead and open to that place. And as you see on the board there, tonight our plan is to cover verses 13 to 25, where our topic is really about the term subjection, which is a rather controversial idea that Peter is really going to hammer on here. And we'll probably involve ourselves in a little controversy tonight, depending on how spunky you guys are feeling about what we're going to talk about, because we have a couple of rather controversial topics in our section, verses 13 to 25. So before we jump into that, I just want to remind you, we're going to read this text in just a second. I want to remind you that Peter is concerned about influence. That last little section of verses 11 and 12 that we covered last week, where he says in verse 11, "Beloved, I urge you as sojourners and exiles to abstain from the passions of the flesh, which wage war against your soul. Keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable, so that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of visitation." So that last part where he says people are watching you and they're trying to have some accusation to make. They want to speak against you as evildoers, but they can't, because all they see are good works. They don't see anything evil. So he's thinking in terms of what the watching world sees in Christians. And he says you need to live in a way that doesn't give them anything to aim at, which is the way I put it here. And this is going to frame what we're going to talk about in verses 13 to 17 especially. The whole section here on government has that as its backdrop, that people are watching you and they're going to watch how you interact with those who are in authority over you. Especially in verse 15, he says, "This is the will of God, that by doing good you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people." So that same idea as in verse 12 is here in verse 15, and that's going to frame what we're doing. So I think we need to know as we read this text and as we study it tonight that Peter is thinking, if God's people are subject, if they are willing to go about these relationships that they're in with this willingness to submit even to people who are not necessarily honorable or we don't necessarily agree with, that will be a way we have influence on the world. And so I want to share that with you, and I'm going to keep hitting that as we go through the class, because I think that's a little bit contrary to the way we view things, and it might even be a notable new thought for us as Americans, because in America we have a different attitude toward the government, and we have a different set of expectations about how we respond to government that might make us take a passage like this in a different way. We'll cover that more as we go. I want to read just the whole section, verse 13 to 25, and then we'll jump in. Verse 13, "Be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor as supreme, or to governors as sent by him to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. Live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as servants of God. Honor everyone, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the emperor. Servants, be subject to your masters with all respect, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the unjust. For this is a gracious thing, when mindful of God, one endures sorrows while suffering unjustly. For what credit is it if when you sin and are beaten for it, you endure? But if when you do good and suffer for it, you endure, this is a gracious thing in the sight of God. For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example so that you might follow in his steps. He committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. When he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body on the tree, that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed. For you were straying like sheep, but have now returned to the shepherd and overseer of your souls." All right, I just want to point out, as we jump into this, that the key terms in this section, the ones you see repeated over and over again, are the idea of be subject, and you'll notice that all the groups here are told that. Subject in 2:13, in verse 18 it's servants, in 3:1 it is wives. So it's the same term and it's used repeatedly. So Peter is kind of maybe we would say he's preaching a sermon, and his first point is about the government, and his second point is about servants, and his third point is about wives and husbands. He also has the idea of honor, where there are a couple of groups to honor all people, and honor the emperor in chapter 2, verse 17. And in 3:7, honor is due from the husband to the wife. The husband is to show honor to the wife as to the weaker vessel. And do good is also very common here. You can see that all these references here where as we go through things, we continue to do good. Do good is one of those phrases that I think we blow right past and don't think about the implications of it. That is not don't do bad things. It is what are you doing in your day, in your week, in your life that you can look at and say that is a good thing. Something has been done, it's good. Or what is talked about here, good deeds. So we'll think about those things as we go. I just want you to see that's the thread that he is tracing, and it connects all these different teaching groups, and really through next week as well. Okay, so verse 13, he says, "Be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor as supreme, or to governors as sent by him to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good." So you have, at least in my version, mine talks about the emperor. I know some of the others have different word there, but basically there's someone who is the head in the Roman Empire time, who is the head of all things. He is the highest. But then there are also lower levels of government who are empowered by the emperor. He says in verse 14, governors, or yours might have a different term there, someone who is sort of an emissary and representative of that government. And just like then, today we have different levels of government, and we interact with government in different ways. Probably we're not going to interact very commonly with the president, but we'll interact with those who represent the different forms, whether a federal or state government. And we have people who are part of the government that we have to engage with. I think the principle here is because of the authority given to them by God, we submit. We are subject to government in whatever form we find it. I want to point out that Peter echoes a lot of Paul's teaching. This is notable to me because it doesn't happen often. In Romans 13, Paul has probably the most famous section in the Bible about government. And he talks about how governments, the powers that be, are instituted by God, and that they don't bear the sword in vain. So, they're sent there by God to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good. So, really, you have these phrases that sound a lot like that. Peter says we do this for the Lord's sake. That's verse 13 there. Be subject for the Lord's sake, which is like Romans 13:5, where he says for conscience sake. And then to punish those who do evil and praise those who do good, which sounds a lot like Romans 13:3 and 4, where he is there to do that, to praise those who do good. And if you don't do good, then be afraid. If you want to have no fear of the government, he says in Romans 13, just do what is right, obey the laws, and you'll receive praise from the government. So this idea is really what it shows me is this is a very uniform way New Testament Christians thought and talked about their relationship to the government. And I think that is especially notable because, as we often say, this is not a time during which it would have been popular to say among Christians, hey, isn't the emperor great? If you took a poll, people would say, no, the emperor is terrible. He keeps hurting people. He keeps throwing the Christians out of Rome. Sometimes he'll kill them. And so we don't like that. But it is a different time than the time in which we live, and a different culture than the one in which we live, where it's not really about what's your opinion. No one's asking anyone's opinion about the government, which is different than in America. We have opinions, we express opinions, we want to hear each other's opinions. Back then it was just, no, you. This is the reality. This is the world. No one cares what you think about it. Just what's going to happen. So it makes a little different, and it strikes us a little different because of that. But I think we can take the simple teaching of being subject for what it is. You also have the idea in verse 17, government has a role and deserves our subjection and our honor. And I put, these are my words, even when it is corrupt, because I don't think that we can, for one, I don't think we can point to any government that's not corrupt, at least on some level or in some form. It is made of humans, and humans are not going to be perfect, so there will always be imperfection and room for criticism of a government. But beyond that, I think we can probably all agree that the Roman Empire, during the time this is written, was corrupt. And yet Peter does not make exceptions about that and say, you know what, if you feel like this is illegitimate, or you feel like this is inappropriate, or you feel like it's overreach, or you feel like Caesar should have more humanity, then you don't have to submit to him. It's just very blanket that this is the posture Christians have toward government. So government has a role. If you want to talk to Paul, Paul's going to tell you God instituted government because God wants government to put a check on evil and to help make life better for people on earth, even though sometimes I know we feel like maybe it doesn't. That's still God's intent with it. So government has a role, and it deserves, I did use the terms deserves, by virtue of the fact that God has instituted authorities. They deserve our subjection and our honor, even when they're corrupt. Verse 15, for this is the will of God, that by doing good you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. So God's intent is that our good deeds silence the critics of our faith. So in this text, it sure seems to me, because of verse 14, sent to punish those who do evil and praise those who do good, that at least part of our doing good is that we're willing to obey what the government tells us to do. And so in doing so, we are blameless when it comes to the government accusing us of doing wrong, or people who would be foolish people who would claim that we're doing wrong. So let me say it this way. Persecution or suffering, which is part of what 1 Peter is about. There's persecution coming. Persecution or suffering should come not because we're doing evil. He's going to talk about that in a few verses here. Sometimes we suffer because we did something foolish or wrong. And Peter says, that's not what I'm talking about. That's not a good thing. There's no nobility in saying, oh, I deserve this, so I'll go ahead and suffer it. So it should come not because we're doing evil, nor because we're dishonoring our government. Because here he is saying that could be a grounds on which people say Christianity should be dismissed, or Christianity should be reported to the authorities, or this is a revolutionary group. They're fomenting problems in the empire. And he says that's not why we suffer. If we're going to suffer, it should be because there is a deliberate attack on faith, on what we believe, on what we claim, not because we're doing wrong or we're acting in a way that's dishonoring government that God has instituted. Verse 16, live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as servants of God. So the idea here is, but that's a good old American verse, isn't it? We love to talk about freedom. Yeah, live as free people. But he says, because you're Christians, because you've been set free from sin, think of yourself as free. You're not bound to anything, but refuse to abuse your freedom. So instead of it becoming what he calls a cloak for vice, a cover-up for evil, we remember we're still servants. We're servants of God, and because we're servants of God, we willingly choose to submit. We willingly offer our subjection. And when I say willingly, what I am implying is we don't only obey because government can punish us if we don't. That's true. Government can punish us if we don't. But we don't only obey out of fear of the government. We also obey because we choose to do it because God says this is a good and right thing to do. And he says that, by the way, not just in 1 Peter 2, but repeatedly in other places in the New Testament, including in 1 Timothy 2, we've talked about recently. Verse 17, honor everyone, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the emperor. We could spend a while, by the way, on honor everyone, because there is a sort of respect that all people deserve, no matter what, just because they're people, made in the image of God. And there's a way we treat people just because of that. But I do want to distinguish, that's different from the idea that we have respect and honor for people because they're righteous people and we look up to them. Okay, we don't do that for everybody. There are some people who are dishonorable in the way they live, and he is not saying, hey, hold those people up and praise them. He is instead saying there is a certain level of honor that all people deserve. And we choose to honor those people because we honor all people. That includes the emperor. And this idea of honoring other people can coexist with loving the brotherhood or brethren and fearing God. So there's no incompatibility there. He says all those things in the same breath in verse 17, that you can honor all people, and you can love your brethren, and you can fear God, and you can still honor the emperor. I just want to remind you that the religious leaders challenged Jesus to try to parse those things out. Say, do we honor Caesar or do we honor God? And which one do we go to? And Jesus says, essentially, yes, both. You know, that you render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and you render to God the things that are God's. But you're not violating God's will by honoring Caesar and paying his taxes. And you're also not somehow disrespecting Caesar by living your life for God and paying God what he is owed, what he deserves. So this is, to me, a mentality idea. So let's say a little about subjection, then I'll open it up for your thoughts. Subjection here, the word that's in verse 13, means respecting those in charge. You can see that from the term honor. And it also means obeying when called upon. Subjection does not always mean obedience, because there are times when we do not obey, but it is instead sort of a posture and attitude out of which obedience can come when called upon. And so when there are taxes that are levied, when there are laws that are made, we submit, we are in subjection, we willingly humble ourselves before our government and say, I will do what the government says, not just because I'm afraid, but because, he says, for the Lord's sake. So I would say it this way. We embrace the roles we were in previously. So before we became Christians, we were probably in submission to the government, right? Most people are. If they're not, they're probably going to be in jail or something. But we embrace those roles we were in previously. Some people were slaves before they became Christians. Some people were married before they became Christians. We're still in those roles. And we may say, you know what, the role itself is not that much different, but that should be new reasons, not no reasons. That doesn't make any sense. We embrace roles we were in previously, but for new reasons. We do it for the Lord's sake, or we do it mindful of God. Or in chapter 3, he's going to talk about wives whose husbands don't obey the word, and yet they continue to submit because there's hope that they may win their husbands. So there is still this mentality that says, Jesus helps me renew my attitude and do the same things I was doing for very different reasons. And I think that's the point here. Be subject willingly because you're following Jesus. All right, so I'm going to start just by opening up. Do you guys have any thoughts, comments about this? Anything you notice in this text or anything that you find challenging here? Do you guys want to talk about? Yeah, Cole?
I actually have... Can you hear me? Hello? Can you hear me? Is it coming through?
Just yell.
So I had a question about just honor and like what that means and the practicality of it. Because like when you look at the definition of honor, it's like you hold it in high esteem. Is it working now? I think it's working. Is it? Okay, I'll just hold it here and I'll talk loud both. It's to hold in high esteem, like when you read like the definition. And from like what you're explaining, it doesn't seem like when I think of that, I'm like, man, I like really look up to this person. I think about everything they do is like I want to be like them. And like a lot of our officials, like I look at them and I don't feel that way. So, and so that being said, like when you think about honor, I'm trying to understand what that means. Is it to like revere or respect the role that they were given by God so that, you know, like their authority still is there and we must respect that in that sense? And like I'm going to use an example. So, you know, you hear all the time like political sayings come up about certain individuals where they're joking about somebody or they say something about one of our political officials. Like laughing at something like that would that be wrong in this case? I mean, in my mind, I'm thinking yes, but I'm just trying to understand like at what level, you know.
Generally speaking, I would say there are two kinds of honor. One is this person is honorable. They do righteous things, and so I have a level of respect for them, maybe even above other people. And we all have people like that. We call them role models, or you know, we think they're worthy of respect. We usually point them out. And then there's a level that's just sort of seems to me to be basic of here are people, they're human beings. So I'm going to be respectful of other humans. I'm not going to talk to them in disrespectful ways. I'm not going to treat them in ways that are dehumanizing because they're people. When you talk about the emperor, I do think it adds that dimension. The emperor is part of a system that's been approved by God and instituted by God. I don't mean a government system, by the way. I'm not talking about God endorses one government over another. Just the idea that God has empowered someone means there's respect due, and there's a certain level of appreciation for that, and to go to your point, I think there's a certain way we should talk about those people. This is more of a modern American problem, what you described, where we are disrespectful of leaders because we are encouraged and allowed in our system to discuss and give our opinions, and that naturally leads to when they do something I don't like or I know something about them that I don't like, I criticize. To me, and we'll all have a different line as to where that point is, where we're being disrespectful or dishonoring. For me, I will say there is, in my judgment, my opinion, a major difference between saying I do not like something someone does, some policy they hold, something like that, and calling them names or insulting them directly as a human being. There are things that impede the job, and then there are things that are me attacking. And that's where my line is. Others may disagree, and we can have a discussion about that, but I think there should be some honor reflected in the way we discuss public officials. Even Paul felt that way. We talk about him cursing the high priest, reviling the high priest in Acts 23.
Right. And I'll just add something to that. Like, I think about at work. Like, there's times where I disagree with my boss, maybe on how something's going to be handled, but I can still disagree with him in a respectful way. Right. Like, I'm just not going to agree with how he's going to handle that, but, there's ways to go about it.
Right.
So that would be the way to do maybe with them.
Disagreement can be respectful or disrespectful. Yeah, we have choices there, but it certainly doesn't mean we have to agree with everything. I don't think we're called on to do that. Yeah, Aaron?
When we're talking about honor, probably the greatest example comes from Jesus. When he's before Pilate, Pilate says, "Do you not know that I have the authority to put you to death?" And for his part, Jesus doesn't deny that authority. He simply tells Pilate, remember where that authority comes from. Mm-hmm. You would have no authority at all if it hadn't been given to you.
Right.
But he doesn't deny that Pilate has that authority, even though Pilate's about to abuse that authority to put an innocent person to death for a crime they didn't commit. And so when you were talking before about corrupt governments, I think that's an answer to what Cole is talking about, is that the master, when he's in front of a corrupt government official, does not, to his face, tell him, he never dishonors Pilate. Now, he doesn't answer some of Pilate's questions, but he never dishonors Pilate. In fact, he acknowledges the authority that Pilate has. The other example, of course, you can go to is Abigail and Naboth?
Nabal.
Nabal, sorry. And she acknowledges that he is a worthless man. And I don't think that's necessarily disparaging of him. I think she is simply stating a fact there to David. But she goes on his behalf to avert disaster. She honors her husband in the things that she does.
Right.
And so you can honor people who are dishonorable.
Yep. I think those are good thoughts. I do think there's a little difference. One of the things about Nabal is his name means fool. And I'm sorry, that's just too easy, So there may be disrespect there, or it may be one of those deals where she's saying, hey, I'm just saying his name. He is a Nabal. That's just who he is. But I do think you're right, especially Jesus before Pilate. So much could have been said there that was not said. And that I think we would probably be tempted to say as we defend ourselves and as we point out his foolishness that Jesus doesn't. And Jesus is put here in later in the chapter as an example as how he suffered is how we should suffer. Yes, Scott?
We do live in a unique country in that we have a constitutional right to petition our government when we have grievances. But that doesn't give us, while we have that right, that doesn't give us the right then to do it in a disrespectful way. I mean, there are ways that we can take our grievances to our elected officials, I think, that are not in violation just of this passage. We just have to do it in the right way and treat them as with honor because of their elected position.
Right.
Now, debate on whether to say this, but passages like this, though, is why, and this is my opinion only, why the opinion that I don't know that I could have fought in the American Revolution, though, because we fought a war over the fact that we didn't have representation and we were getting taxed. I'm not sure that was a justification. I'm thankful we have the country and have the rights we do, but that's a decision everybody would have to make. But I'm not sure. To me, I would have been in violation of passages like this, of being disrespectful to the king, who was not really even. I mean, I don't really think they were really being persecuted that I'm aware of. But so I think there's ways. You treat your government on this. I mean, we have some ability to do some things that most people haven't enjoyed, but we just need to make sure that we do it in a way that's honorable and reflects that we serve God.
Yeah, we'll talk. That is a can of worms that you just opened.
Well, I hesitated to say it, but I said it.
Well, the mic wasn't working, so not everybody heard you, so it's okay. I will just say, because we'll talk about this in a minute with slavery. I think we have to remember that the New Testament is not written from the perspective in which we live now, where people, it's not written from what kind of government are people empowered to choose. It's written from the perspective of ordinary people in a big faceless empire that nobody cares what you think. So it is not written from a perspective of slavery as good or bad. It's just slavery is. This is your world. So how do you live in your world? Emperors are. So how do you treat the emperor? Instead of, what's the wisdom of having an emperor, or should we ever have a revolt? Or, it's not really written from that perspective. So I would say, while I think your tendency is probably the way where I would end up, where there's some hesitancy about that, I still think we have to say, we're really looking at apples and oranges. We'll talk more about that with slavery, which, by the way, is a whole other can of worms. But Brother Phil?
Jacob, the comments I'm going to make are just about me personally, about nobody else's opinion. But for me, I sometimes wonder whether I have been too submissive to our government, whether I have not done enough to try and prevent or slow down the changes in this country that are direct opposite of what the scriptures tell us to do. And I sometimes wonder when I get to heaven, and I'm planning on going to heaven, if the Lord's going to say to me, Phil, I put you in the United States of America, and I allowed you that country to start a new government. And you should remember in history class that it started out as a government based upon biblical principles, a nation under God. And over the last 225 years or whatever, you have allowed it, made very little contribution to it going further away from where God would want it. And I really wonder, I understand. I've taught this subject before, and I've taught exactly what you have taught, but I just really wonder whether we should be. I personally believe that I should have done more over the years, just because of abilities I may or may not have, and opportunities I may have had. That's my thought.
I think the principle you're working from there is we're in a little different position than they were in the first century. And because of that, there's some obligation we have. If we do have a voice in our government, and really a voice generally because we have free speech, we're allowed to speak, how well are we using those gifts? I think is a sobering question. I think we'll probably, because we live in a nation of 300 million people. There'll be lots of opinions and lots of voices, but there's always that sense: am I doing what I can to make this place what God wants it to be? Whether that's just my home, my community, or whether that gets broader. What have we got? Yeah, Claire.
I think the key term here that you mentioned was for the Lord's sake. And so who we honor and how we honor them is dependent not on their behavior or whether we agree with them, but on who God is and what Christ has done.
Right.
And so when we put that as the key thing for how we treat other people, that's going to determine everything that he's laid out in this passage.
Right. I think that's really hard to remember, that it's not about their behavior. Like, nothing here is emperor specific, like this guy and not this guy, or if they're doing a good job or something like that. It has to do with God. And so it goes back to that. Sometimes we make a mistake, and I want to be clear about this. That does not mean that God, he endorses this guy and not this guy, or he endorses this government and not this government. I think it's a little more indirect than that, where God says, this is how I want you to have government to govern behavior on the planet, and I want you to respect, as my people, to respect that. But it is about God and not about the person. I think that's important to remember. Who have we got? Keegan?
Yeah, I mean, you kind of alluded to it earlier about this modern era, and I think that's kind of probably where all of our minds went, was in conflict. In this day and age, it seems that people so quickly turn to disrespect or whatever it may be. And I think that this alludes to that, to our point of, and maybe that's some of the reason, like Phil was saying a while ago, was that maybe that's sometimes what holds us back, right? Sometimes that may hold us back from saying something or doing something which we should because of the conflict that's out there. But there's a way to handle it, and that way to handle it is with respect, with honor. You could still get your point across with handling it in that manner.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll just say, when we talk about disrespect, I'm not very old. I have seen that dramatically increase on both sides, both parties. And I've been shocked because I've heard that with Christians saying those kinds of things about, sometimes it's about the Democratic president, sometimes it's about the Republican president, back and forth it goes. It's really, to me, deeper than the actual issue. So I think there's something, like you're saying, there's a way you can talk, and there's a way we can present what we believe, but also reflect Christ, like we're talking about here. Yeah, Curtis?
I think you're right you're going the right direction here on this, because I think one other issue that goes even beyond the worthiness of political figures to be able to be respected, but we as pilgrims and aliens here need to make sure that our speech is not so disrespectful of people in the other party that we offend and cause problems with brethren. I've seen situations where you'll have people get on Facebook or get on something else and make all kinds of intemperate comments about that, and it winds up causing trouble between brethren. I've seen places where it causes problems in a local congregation. I'm a pilgrim and a stranger here.
Yeah.
I don't want to do anything that's going to cause problems between me and a brother because of something that is of no eternal consequence. And I think it's important for us to remember that.
Right. I agree. I've also seen that talked directly to some people that said they would not worship with such and such a person because they voted for such and such a person. And I do. I think we, by the way we talk and the way we think about these things, we may introduce more division than we realize. All right. I'm going to close the can of worms for now and try to move on to the next can of worms, which is in verse 18. I appreciate you guys and your thoughts. So let's talk about servants and masters. Verse 18. Servants, be subject to your masters with all respect, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the unjust. So that's the same word, subjection. Peter urges subjection for slaves with their masters, even when the masters are unjust, it says in verse 18, which fits with what we've just been talking about, right? The idea of independent of the character or the behavior of the emperor, you submit to him here, regardless of the way the master treats you. Slavery, like I mentioned, was a reality in the ancient world, although I believe it was in a form different from American slavery, both in its how it began, how people got to be slaves, and also, for the most part, although there were some exceptions, the brutality of it was much worse in America than in the ancient world. I also want to restate this. The New Testament is not written from a perspective of governmental change. Like, let's change this or that. We have a very different perspective in our time because we have practice as a nation with, what's the best government? What kind of policy decisions should we make? This is written from a perspective of, here's the reality. Here are people who are on the ground. They're slaves. They come to Christ and they're slaves. How do you live now? What do you do? Really, the idea of them being set free is just not practically possible. So what do you do? How do you live in that situation? So how should a Christian, seemingly powerless, deal with injustice in a relationship in which he had no volition? That's a really difficult question. Somebody came to you with that question, I don't even know that we would know how to, that question wouldn't compute. We don't really have, as Americans, we have so many rights that we take for granted that to think of a situation where you have no choice, nothing you can do. So how do you, when you're seemingly powerless, deal with injustice? And so Peter says, suffer and be subject and trust that God sees and knows what is happening to you. So verse 19, for this is a gracious thing when mindful of God one endures sorrows while suffering unjustly. For what credit is it if when you sin and are beaten for it you endure, but if when you do good and suffer for it you endure, this is a gracious thing in the sight of God. So this is what I would call true injustice. You have done nothing wrong, and yet you are suffering because someone is literally unjust. They are not doing the right thing. And so he makes a distinction. He says suffering true injustice is a gracious thing to God, but suffering for our own mistakes is not virtuous. Now, that's not to say that there can't be something you learn from your own mistakes and the suffering it brings. And sometimes that can produce something better in us and forge some patience and maybe even prove some repentance or something like that. But it's just different. And Peter is saying, don't think those are the same thing. Just any suffering is not the same as suffering for a righteous cause. In the same way that if you mouth off to the emperor and you get in trouble, that's not the same as him coming and seeking you out because you're a follower of Jesus. Those are two different things. One is unjust. The other is you kind of should have known better. It's kind of the result of your own actions. So Peter teaches slaves and all Christians to process suffering through a new lens, which is following Jesus' example. And that's where I want to go. I want to say something, though, before I leave, especially verse 18. Because I have to say this. It is a little bit shocking to me to learn some of the history of how passages like these were used in this country to talk about slavery. And I think we have to kind of talk about the elephant in the room for a minute, which is if you take a passage like 1 Peter 2:18, and you are a white slave owner in the South, and you say to your slaves, you have to obey me and put up with my harsh treatment because the Bible tells you so, I think there is something that is especially devious and sick about that, where not only am I living in a way that is contrary to Scripture, but I'm also abusing the faith. And very many slave owners in the South would try to convince their slaves to become Christians and then try to force them to accept the brutal treatment that they were under based on 1 Peter 2:18. That disturbs me. And it disturbs me for the Bible to be used that way. I did some work when I was in school here on the way the Bible was used to justify slavery and the different arguments that were used during the time of American slavery, especially the 1800s when the abolition debate was raging. It is upsetting to me as a preacher. It is upsetting to me as an American and someone who was raised in the South. It is upsetting to me as a Christian to see the Bible become a part of that when obviously that is not the tenor of what we're reading. So I just want to say that I can see how a passage like this would be very frustrating for a lot of people. I don't think Peter is intending it to say, hey, nobody ever have any problem with unjust treatment. He is instead saying, when you're in a position where you have no choice, you are just where Jesus was. When you are in a position where other people are taking advantage of you, you are just where Jesus was. And if you've got to endure with that kind of character. So let's keep going here. Verse 21, for to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example so that you might follow in his steps. He committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. When he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. Those two verses, 22 and 23, are just stressing this was really unjust. He had done nothing deserving this kind of suffering and punishment. Instead, there was no deceit in his mouth. He had no sin. He didn't revile in return. Nothing he did would precipitate a crucifixion. That's not fair. And yet, he was willing to go through that. And he did it in verse 21 for us. And now he leaves us an example. So our call, the fact that God has called us to something, may involve unjust suffering, but so did Jesus's. And we're all blessed by his suffering and his willingness to accept that suffering. Through this passages, he references Isaiah 53 3 different times. The verse 22 there, neither was deceit found in his mouth, is from Isaiah 53. The idea in verse 24, by his wounds you've been healed, and verse 25, you're straying like sheep. Those are all Isaiah 53, which is a beautiful passage. I don't know if you spent any time there. Isaiah 53 is an amazing foretaste of what the Messiah is going to do. So instead of taking vengeance himself, it says Jesus entrusted himself to him who judges justly. He accepted injustice and said, God will take care of this. God will judge justly when the time is right. He's confident that God will remedy injustice at the proper time. And Jesus had that confidence, and that's why he entrusted himself that way. It says there in verse, where's the entrusting? Verse 23. Okay, so verse 24, he himself bore our sins in his body on the tree, that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed. For you were straying like sheep, but have now returned to the shepherd and overseer of your souls. So the point here is that Jesus' unjust suffering was for our blessing and healing, which just introduces a new idea. So when you're in a position where you're suffering and it's wrong, and you're suffering and there's nothing you can do about it, not only was Jesus there, not only did Jesus suffer that way, but also Jesus had a redemptive quality to his suffering. It did something. It produced good. God turned that hardship and made it into good. And this is something, I know you guys know this is a biblical theme. This comes up again and again in the Bible, but it's something we have to remember when we're going through difficult times, that just because things are unfair doesn't mean that there's no point or no good that can come out of it. Just because it's unjust doesn't mean it can't be redemptive. So Peter says, as a result of this sacrifice, we should, verse 25 there, verse 24, die to sin and live to righteousness, which reinforces all that we've been saying about doing good. But we do good with a new perspective, a perspective on life, on death, and on difficulty, that it's okay if things are hard, and it's okay if things are unfair, and it's okay if bad people are in charge of us. It's okay because we're trusting God who judges justly. All right, let me give you a few applications. I'll see if you guys have anything. We got 1 minute. Okay, first, God's people are to be known for their good works, not their evil. There's a little bit of a spotlight problem here because God's people are humans and we're going to make mistakes. And so sometimes those mistakes are what people focus on. I just think it's important for Peter to say, when you are choosing who you're going to be and what you're going to do, remember that other people are looking to you to decide what is a Christian. How do I view these people? How do I view this group? And so God's people should be known for their good works, and in that way we can put to silence the ignorance of foolish men. We honor and we submit ourselves to our government. I don't feel like we need to put a lot of asterisks there. Let me just say, of course, nobody has said this tonight, we obey God rather than men when those things come into conflict. When the government tries to tell us or force us to do things that are wrong or not to do things that are right, that God has called on us to do, then we defy the government. But that is an exception, and the rule is we honor and submit ourselves to the government. And then we honor and submit to those in power over us. Thinking here of slaves and masters. I have a hard time linking this directly to employee-employer stuff because we have so many different rights in an employee-employer relationship, especially in this country, where, if they're being unfair to you, you can, go to different boards and courts and HR and all this, and maybe you can say, well, even though I didn't get all my rights met, I just don't like it here, I'm leaving. Slaves didn't have that option. Unjust suffering in slavery was a different matter. So I would just put it broadly, we honor and submit to those in power over us, even willing to suffer injustice. A willingness there, that suffering is not the end of my faith or the end of a relationship. And then, let me just say it this way, we cannot benefit from Jesus' suffering. Maybe I should say we should not benefit from Jesus' suffering and then be unwilling to suffer for him and for other people. That we can't just receive the blessing from someone else doing something hard, say, but I don't want to do anything hard, I don't want to go through anything bad. So Peter is saying, you follow Jesus, he is your example, you follow his steps. All right, we may dig back into this next week, but we need